Lecture 1, Torah, Old Testament, and Hebrew Bible.
An introduction to Judaism is not as easy as it sounds because Judaism itself is more than just a religion. Judaism incorporates an ethnicity, a culture, a lifestyle. Some people talk about Judaism as a civilization. What we're going to be doing in this course is looking at the specific religious aspects of Judaism as they have changed and unfolded over a 3,000-year period, from the Hebrew Bible or Torah to today. But we can't totally ignore the historical changes that serve as the backdrop for some of these political, theological, and religious changes that also track on to the way that Judaism has unfolded through time. The Hebrew Bible is Judaism's foundation text, but knowing the Hebrew Bible will tell you surprisingly little about how Judaism is expressed in the modern period. So we'll begin our course by taking a look at the relationship between the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the Old Testament, and contemporary Judaism, what the relationship is between those terms and modern Judaism. We'll then begin to describe the early varieties of Judaism, and by early, I mean about the time of Jesus, about 2,000 years ago. Although Jewish history is not one long tale of travails, there have been several catastrophes that powerfully shaped the Jewish consciousness. So in the second lecture, we'll talk about the history as presented in the Hebrew Bible, from the destruction of the first temple in 586 to the destruction of the second temple by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. That 586 was before the Common Era, and we'll talk about why we're not using BC and AD also at that point. In the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, there were several groups that had been competing for power, for hegemony within that Jewish community, and the winner was Rabbinic Judaism. So in general, for the rest of this class, for the rest of the course, when I talk about Judaism, I'm really talking about Rabbinic Judaism, unless I specify otherwise. So after discussing what we know about those power struggles to assume leadership in the Jewish world, we'll look at some of the core values and practices of Rabbinic Judaism, specifically Torah study, repentance, worship, and deeds of loving kindness. We're going to keep our eyes on how those ideas and values are expressed in the Hebrew Bible, but also to get a feel for the innovative daringness of the rabbis, to see how the rabbis developed those ideas in a world that no longer had the central religious institution that characterized biblical Judaism, namely the temple. Not everything changes once the temple is destroyed, but many, many things change as a result of the destruction of the temple. And so we want to be sensitive to how the changes in the political fortunes of Israel affect changes in religious practice as well as theology. With the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70, holy space in terms of the temple becomes less important, and holy time or holiness in time becomes more important. It's promoted. So we're going to spend several lectures looking at specific holidays in Judaism that shape the Jewish calendar and that really give punctuation to the Jewish year and to Jewish life. So we'll be looking at the Sabbath and the high holidays, the New Year and the Day of Atonement, Passover and Pentecost, as well as some minor holidays. And we'll be sensitive to the fact that many of these holidays in the Bible were rooted in the land of Israel and agricultural holidays in the land of Israel. But once the Jews were no longer living in the land of Israel, other aspects of those holidays had to be accentuated. At that point, we'll move into the Middle Ages and take a look at some of the new expressions of Judaism that we see in the Middle Ages, specifically Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism, starting in the 11th and 12th centuries. We'll take as our case studies the problem of evil, the creation of the world, prayer and the reasons for the commandments and see how Jewish philosophy and Jewish mysticism have very different responses to what the underlying conditions are for creation or evil or prayer. Our next 5 sessions will be devoted to Judaism as it makes the transition into modernity. And so we'll be looking at the emergence of the Jewish community from its insulated medieval corporations, as they were called, how they lived and governed themselves, to emancipation. And in emancipation, everything changed. Right? You can't find an expression of Judaism today that's just like Jews lived 300 years ago. Emancipation changed everything. So we'll be taking a look at ultra-Orthodoxy and modern Orthodoxy and Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist Judaisms as a way of understanding how some of those groups 200 years ago, 100 years ago, adopted themselves to the new conditions in Western Europe and then later on in Eastern Europe of emancipation. And really for the first time in 2,000 years, we have the opportunity of people identifying themselves with either the land of Israel, namely this phenomenon of Zionism that hadn't been possible for 2,000 years, or people identifying themselves with the people of Israel, people who are cultural Jews and may very well be atheists. Right? You can be a Jewish atheist, although it's a contradiction in terms to be a Christian atheist. The reason why you can be a Jewish atheist is precisely because Judaism incorporates more than just religion. So you can identify today with the land of Israel, the people of Israel, or the Torah of Israel, and really relate to Judaism primarily as a religion. Our last few sessions will take a look at how some sensitive and controversial topics have unfolded from the biblical period to today. Specifically, we'll be looking at the role and status of women in the Jewish world. We'll also be looking at how Judaism understands Christianity. Is it an expression of idolatry because of the divinization of Jesus, or is it another path to the one God? And finally, we'll talk about the vexing question of Jews as the chosen people. Were we chosen? If so, by whom? And for what purpose? In general, this course could just as easily be called an introduction to Judaisms, because we'll see that for every topic we cover, we have a multiplicity of responses and a multiplicity of answers. So on the one hand, the course could be an introduction to Judaisms. On the other hand, we want to be sensitive to what is common and what unites all of the different Judaisms that we discuss. Okay, so let's now move into our first topic, which is the relationship between the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and Judaism over here. Now, the terminology affects how you understand what we're talking about. How one designates that corpus of books, variously known as the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, often involves ideological assumptions about how the text is to be understood. The word Tanakh is the Hebrew acronym for Torah, which in this sense means the 5 books, or the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Tanakh. That N stands for Nevi'im, which is the Hebrew word for prophets. And Ketuvim, Ka, Tanakh, the Cha and the Ka in Hebrew have the same letter, is the writings. So the books in the prophetic section, we have the historical books of the prophets like Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings. And then we have the big prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, as well as the minor prophets. And the Ketuvim, the writings, we have Song of Songs and Proverbs and Psalms and Ruth and Esther and Daniel up until Chronicles. Right? That's the Tanakh. The Old Testament is how some early Christians referred to this text, since it had been superseded in their eyes by the New Testament. Jews generally don't refer to this book as the Old Testament because they don't have a New Testament. So Jews often call the entire book Torah. The word Torah literally means a teaching or an instruction. In Hebrew, the way we say teacher is moreh or morah. And in the wisdom of the Hebrew language, the way to say parents is horayim, which has the same root as Torah, because according to biblical Judaism anyway, it's your parents who should be the primary teachers in the family, right? Not shipping them off to to the public or private schools. So maybe the folks that do homeschooling know this truth about the language. But the word Torah can mean just an individual teaching. It can refer to the entire 5 books. Torah can also refer to the entire Tanakh. And Torah can also refer to what happens later, and including the whole warehouse of Jewish thought and expression, including what we do in this room today. Some contemporary scholars, in an effort to maintain religious neutrality, they opt to describe this text by its language, the Hebrew Bible. Now, it's true that some of the later books, like Daniel, also have Aramaic. So the entire book doesn't have Hebrew in it, but the vast majority of words in the Hebrew Bible are indeed in Hebrew, even though we've got some Aramaic as well. But the problem with describing it as the Hebrew Bible is that faith communities have a very different reading of the Hebrew Bible, whether we're talking about the Christian faith community or the Jewish faith community, than do academic scholars of the Hebrew Bible. I tell my students at Vanderbilt, where I teach, that I don't know very much about the Hebrew Bible. Why? Because I didn't get my PhD in Bible, where I would have had to learn Akkadian and Ugaritic and Mesopotamian myths in order to compare the Hebrew Bible to the other contemporary languages and literatures that were going on at the time the authors of the Hebrew Bible composed those texts. If they want to know something about the Torah, about Jewish interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, I'm happy to try to help. I know something about that. But there's a disjunction between what the academics will tell us about the meaning of the Hebrew Bible and how Jews and Christians relate to that text. Furthermore, the assumptions about the authorship of the text often vary dramatically between the academic community and Jews and Christians. So we're going to talk about some of the differences, not just in terminology, but the differences in meanings and the assumptions about the text with case studies from the creation stories of Genesis 1 through 3 and that law that appears 3 different times in the Hebrew Bible, or in the Torah, as I will now refer to it, about not seething a kid, lamb or a baby goat in this case, in its mother's milk. Okay, so let's talk about the assumptions of the text before we actually get to these case studies. Up until about the 17th century, both Christians and Jews related to the Torah as a divine document, whether it's divine dictation or whether it's channeling from God to Moses. But the traditional assumption was that God presented what is in the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai. Additional assumptions about the Hebrew Bible, traditional assumptions, include that the text was cryptic. It meant more than it said on the surface. So you need to read deeply in order to understand what God had intended in that text. After all, if the Torah was written by God, then it should be read differently than if the Torah was written by human beings. If it's instruction manual by human beings, you want to follow the text literally, because human beings don't know how to write in a kind of encrypted way for an audience. But both early Christian and early Jewish interpreters of the Torah understood that the Torah was cryptic. It was also perfect. Now, what does that mean, that the text was perfect? It was not filled with contradictions. It was not filled with misspellings or with abnormalities between the gender of the noun and the gender of the verb, which you have to have consonants in Hebrew between the gender of the noun and the gender of the verb, and that it would be good, right? It's perfect. It's good. Right? Modern scholars don't share that assumption, but we'll talk about modern assumptions in a moment. And finally, that the text of the Torah or the Hebrew Bible is relevant. It's not just an old, dusty history book filled with genealogies with people's names who you can't pronounce, but it says something to you and is meaningful to your life today, and it will be that case for every subsequent generation, right? Because why would God waste God's breath, as it were, on writing history when we're more concerned about the present reality than about what happened in hoary antiquity?